Did medieval hearts beat with desires so strong they turned to forbidden arts? What secrets did cunning folk whisper to desperate lovers under the moonlit sky? From the bustling towns of the 14th century to the quiet villages of the 12th, love spells were sought, feared, and sometimes spectacularly backfired. Were these desperate acts a path to true affection, or a spiral into unexpected doom? Number 9. The Executioner's Plea. The village of Oakhaven lay nestled by the river, its stone houses huddled close, their thatch roofs a patchwork against the green hills. But one dwelling stood apart, a small, somber cottage at the edge of the woods. Its windows often shuttered. This was the home of Elara and her father, the village executioner. Fear of her father's grim profession extended to Elara, wrapping her in a shroud of isolation thicker than the winter mists. Children would dart away from her path, mothers would pull their skirts closer, and whispers would follow her like shadows. Despite the dread that surrounded her family, Elara possessed a quiet kindness, a gentle spirit often overlooked beneath the weight of her lineage. Her hands, though accustomed to the somber duties of their household, were deft and surprisingly artistic, often sketching wildflowers on scraps of parchment, salvaged from the local scribe. She longed for connection, for someone to see beyond the executioner's daughter and recognize the girl. Beneath her gaze often fell upon Gareth, the village blacksmith. Gareth was a man of immense strength, his muscles honed by years of wielding a hammer, his face perpetually smudged with soot. Yet he possessed a laugh as warm as his forge, and a surprisingly gentle demeanor. Unlike the others, Gareth never flinched when Elara approached his smithy to deliver her father's minted tools or to collect coal. He would offer her a nod, sometimes a quiet word about the weather, and his eyes held no trace of fear, only a calm acknowledgement. This simple kindness, so rare in her solitary life, bloomed into a desperate hope within Elara's heart. She yearned for his touch, for his understanding, for a life where she was not defined by her father's calling. The thought of Gareth smiling at her, truly smiling, was a fragile dream she clung to in the dark hours. The village, like many during the medieval period, held a complex relationship with the unseen. Though the church preached against sorcery and demonic influence, old superstitions persisted, woven into the daily rhythm of life. Wise women, often called cunning folk, were consulted for everything, from curing illnesses to finding lost items. They occupied a liminal space, tolerated for their practical knowledge, yet always eyed with suspicion, especially when their remedies touched upon matters of the heart. Elara, in her quiet desperation, knew of one such woman, an old crone named Morwen, who lived even deeper in the woods, rumored to possess ancient knowledge, passed down through generation. Morwen was a figure of both reverence and fear. Her small cottage adorned with dried herbs and animal bones, her eyes holding the ancient wisdom of the forest. One moonless night, driven by an ache that had become unbearable, Elara gathered her courage. She slipped from her cottage, a few meager silver coins clutched in her hand, and followed the winding path to Morwen's secluded dwelling. The air was cool and damp, the sounds of the forest amplifying her pounding heart. Morwen greeted her with an unblinking stare, her face a rodat of wrinkles, her voice like rustling leaves. Elara, her words tumbling out in a desperate whisper, confessed her longing for Gareth, her plea for a love spell. Morwen listened, her gaze steady, occasionally nodding. She explained the risks, the potential for unintended consequences, the delicate balance of such magic. But Elara, blinded by her desire, heard only the promise of Gareth's affection. Morwen finally agreed, demanding a lock of Elara's hair and a small piece of cloth from Gareth's clothing, along with a handful of the silver coins. She also instructed Elara to gather certain herbs at dawn, vervain for protection, rosemary for remembrance, and a sprig of willow for sorrow, ingredients believed to hold powerful properties in medieval folk magic. Over the next 3 days, Elara diligently followed Morwen's intricate instructions. She ground the herbs into a fine powder with a stone mortar, and pestle as Morwen had shown her. She mixed them with a single drop of her own blood, a potent addition in many ancient beliefs, and a thread from Gareth's work tunic, carefully retrieved from a pile of discarded rags outside his smithy. She chanted the words Morwen had taught her, ancient rhymes that spoke of binding hearts and stirring affections. Her voice, barely a whisper in the quiet of her room. The most crucial part of the spell involved a small, specially prepared honey cake. Morwen had emphasized the need for Gareth to consume this cake as sympathetic magic, where an object or food linked to a person could influence them, was a core principle of such practices. Elara was to bake the powder into the cake, a sweet confection laced with potent intent. Elara baked the honey cake with trembling hands, the sweet aroma mingling with the faint earthy scent of the herbs. She took immense care, shaping it perfectly, hoping her care would translate into love. The next morning, feigning a simple errand, she visited Gareth at his smithy. The forge roared, sparks danced, and the clang of his hammer echoed through the air. Gareth, wiping sweat from his brow, offered her a weary but polite smile. "Good morning, Elara. What brings you out so early?" She offered him the cake, wrapped in a clean linen cloth. "My father thought you might enjoy a little treat. He says you work too hard." Gareth's eyes lit up. He rarely received such thoughtful gestures. "That is very kind of him and of you, Elara, thank you." Took a bite, his face relaxing into an expression of pleasure. Elara's heart soared, a fragile flutter of hope taking flight. For the first few days, nothing seemed to change. Gareth continued his work, his interactions with Elara remaining polite, nothing more. Cold dread began to creep into Elara's heart, replacing her earlier hope. Had the spell failed? Had she somehow done it wrong? Then, subtle shifts began. Gareth started looking at her more intently, his gaze lingering. He would go out of his way to offer a friendly word, to inquire about her father, to even share a brief anecdote about his day. Elara's spirits lifted, a warm glow spreading through her. The spell was working. She thought it was taking hold. She saw a future where she was no longer an outcast. A future where Gareth truly saw her. However, the change in Gareth intensified beyond affection. He began to appear at her cottage, at odd hours, offering unsolicited help with chores, bringing her small gifts of wildflowers or polished stones. His polite interest escalated into an almost suffocating devotion. His eyes, once warm and kind, now held a strange intensity, a desperate hunger. He would speak of her constantly to anyone who would listen, extolling her virtues, her beauty, her kindness, in a way that felt unnatural and forced. He neglected his work, his forge going cold as he spent hours simply watching her from a distance or seeking her out for increasingly long, awkward conversations. Villagers began to notice. Whispers, which had once been about Elara's father, now turned to Gareth's strange behavior. "He's acting peculiar," one woman might murmur to another. Always staring at the executioner's daughter, the villagers' concern grew. Gareth, once a pillar of their community, reliable and hard-working, was now erratic, distracted, and strangely obsessed with Elara. He often spoke of her in riddles, claiming she had a special light or a binding spirit. This was not the natural courtship the village expected. The elderly women, steeped in local folklore, remembered tales of young men bewitched by cunning women. They recalled stories of love charms gone awry, turning affection into obsession, or worse, madness. Fear began to fester, fueled by the church's pronouncements against witchcraft and the devil's influence. In the medieval mind, any inexplicable change in behavior, especially one that seemed to defy reason and social norms, could easily be attributed to malevolent forces. The line between simple folk magic and dark sorcery was thin and often blurred by fear. One morning, Gareth's strange devotion climaxed in a terrifying display. He burst into the village market square, His clothes disheveled, his eyes wide and unfocused. He began to shout Elara's name, declaring his undying love for her, but his words were laced with a disturbing frenzy. He spoke of being unable to live without her, of a powerful force drawing him to her. Then he crumbled to his knees, clutching his head, his face contorted in pain. "She has bewitched me," he wailed, his voice raw with anguish. "She has put a spell on me." The crowd, already primed by weeks of whispers, gasped. The word bewitched hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Panic erupted, fear, ancient and primal, seized the villagers. The accusations against Elara spread like wildfire. The villagers, now convinced that Gareth's strange behavior was the result of a dark enchantment, converged on her cottage. They shouted demands for her to confess, their faces twisted with fear and anger. Elara, trembling, denied everything. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. Her father, the executioner, who had always been a figure of terrifying authority, now found himself powerless against the mob's hysteria. He tried to reason with them to protect his daughter, but their fear was too great. The village elder, a stern, devout man, citing passages from the Bible, condemning sorcery, declared that Elara must be purified. Her evil purged from their midst, the consequence for Elara was swift and brutal. She was seized, her protests ignored, and dragged to the center of the village square. There, before the terrified eyes of the community, a trial by ordeal was arranged, a common method of determining guilt or innocence in medieval times when concrete evidence was lacking. For Elara, it was the ordeal of cold water. Her hands and feet were bound, a rope tied around her waist, and she was thrown into the river. The belief was that pure water, a divine element, would reject the guilty, causing them to float, while the innocent would sink, Elara weighed down by dread and the heavy bonds. She was pulled out, half-drowned, her body shivering uncontrollably. The villagers, seeing her sink, proclaimed her innocent, but the fear of her remained. The spell had not won her love, but instead had exposed her to the community's terror, nearly costing her life. The aftermath was devastating. Gareth, slowly recovering from the strange trance that had bound him, remembered little of his fervent declarations. He was deeply ashamed. His reputation as a steady, reliable craftsman marred by the episode. He avoided Elara, entirely unable to look her in the eye. The memory of his bizarre behavior and the public accusation lingered in the village, a constant reminder of the day the executioner's daughter had seemingly turned a man's mind. Elara, though cleared by the ordeal, found herself even more isolated than before. The brief glimmer of hope that Gareth's kindness had offered was extinguished. The village, while no longer openly hostile, regarded her with a deeper, more entrenched suspicion. The spell had not only failed to bring her love, but had severed the only tentative connection she had found. She returned to her solitary life at the edge of the woods, the weight of her father's profession compounded by the shadow of a love spell gone terribly, irrevocably. The echoes of Gareth's desperate cries, "She has bewitched me," would haunt her, a bitter reminder of a gamble that had cost her everything. Number 8. The Gilded Mirror. Lady Isolde was not merely a noblewoman of the 13th century. She was a chess piece in the grand game of political alliances that defined medieval European courts. Her beauty was undeniable, her lineage impeccable, tying her to one of the most ancient houses in the realm. From her earliest days, she understood that her purpose was to marry well, to secure lands, to forge powerful connections for her family. Love, in the romantic sense, was a luxury rarely afforded to women of her station. Marriages were contracts, solemn agreements, drawn up by scribes, debated by lords, and sealed with intricate seals. Yet Isolde, hidden within the gilded cage of her noble life, harbored a secret yearning. She had heard tales of courtly love of knights, performing valiant deeds for ladies, of passionate devotion, even if such stories were often confined to epic poems and traveling minstrels' songs. One prince, in particular, had captured her imagination. Prince Alaric, of the neighboring kingdom, known for his keen mind and his progressive ideas on governance, not just his military prowess. He was a man of letters as much as he was a warrior, a rare combination that intrigued Isolde far more than mere physical attractiveness. She had seen his portrait, a carefully rendered miniature brought by an envoy, and read dispatches detailing his diplomatic efforts. He was to her young heart a beacon of intellect and potential. The possibility of a politically advantageous match with Alaric was already being whispered in the court, a strategic union that would solidify both kingdoms against a common threat. But Isolde wanted more than a political bond. She yearned for a genuine connection, a meeting of minds. This desire, so uncommon for her time, led her down a path that few noble women dared to tread. Medieval courts, despite their outward piety, were hotbeds of intrigue, and whispers of various forms of magic were never far from the ears of those who knew where to listen. Divination, the practice of seeking knowledge of the future or the unknown, was particularly tempting for those entangled in the uncertainties of courtly life. Scrying mirrors, crystal balls, and even bowls of water were believed to offer glimpses into destiny, to reveal the truth hidden from mortal eyes. Many a lady of the court, frustrated by the slow machinations of political strategy, would secretly consult a wise woman or a charlatan for insight into her future husband, or the success of an important venture. These practices, though condemned by the Church as demonic arts, persisted due to their alluring promise of control over an unpredictable world. Isolde, desperate to glimpse her potential future with Prince Alaric, turned to an old woman named Elara, a former lady-in-waiting to her grandmother, who had retired to a secluded cottage on the estate. Elara was known for her knowledge of herbs and old lore, a quiet woman who had seen much of life and spoke little. Isolde had heard hushed tales of Elara's ability to see things in a polished obsidian mirror she kept hidden away. Approaching Elara was a risk, a deviation from the strict etiquette of court life, but Isolde's yearning pushed her forward. She visited Elara under the pretense of seeking a remedy for a persistent headache, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. Elara, with her knowing eyes, seemed to understand Isolde's true purpose almost immediately. Elara agreed to help, but warned Isolde of the unpredictable nature of such visions. She instructed Isolde to return on the night of the new moon, bringing a lock of Prince Alaric's hair, a formidable challenge for a noblewoman whose only contact with him was through letters and portraits. Isolde, however, was resourceful. During a rare diplomatic exchange where Alaric's envoy visited her court, she managed to discreetly obtain a single strand of his dark hair from a cloak he had briefly left behind. It was a risky maneuver, but her desperation fueled her boldness. On the designated night, Isolde again slipped away to Elara's cottage. The old woman prepared the mirror, carefully polishing the obsidian surface, which seemed to absorb all the light in the room. She placed a single beeswax candle beside it, its flickering flame casting dancing shadows. Elara then began a low, rhythmic chant in an ancient tongue, sprinkling dried herbs around the mirror. She placed Alaric's hair upon the mirror's surface, instructing Isolde to focus all her thoughts on the prince and her desire for his love. Isolde stared into the mirror, her mind a whirlwind of anticipation. The surface of the obsidian, initially dull, began to shimmer, then to swirl with misty patterns. Her heart raced, believing she was on the cusp of seeing a romantic vision, a glimpse of Alaric declaring his undying affection for her. She focused intently, pouring all her longing into the dark, reflective surface. The mist slowly cleared, resolving into a scene. But it was not what she expected. She saw Alaric, yes, but he was not embracing her or whispering sweet nothings. He was at a map table, his brow furrowed in concentration, surrounded by strategists and advisors. He gestured decisively, tracing lines across a parchment with a long, elegant finger. The scene shifted. She saw him in a bustling marketplace, speaking with merchants, his expression thoughtful. Then a quick flash of him on horseback leading a small contingent of riders through a muddy path, his face determined. No declarations of love, No tender glances, no passionate embraces. Only scenes of his public life, his political duties, his strategic mind at work. The visions were clear, sharp, but utterly devoid of personal affection or romance. Isolde watched a strange mix of disappointment and clarity washing over her. She had sought a vision of love, a confirmation of a romantic destiny. What she received was a stark portrayal of Alaric's true focus, his kingdom, his people, his strategic endeavors. The mirror had shown her the man, not the romantic ideal she had constructed in her mind. He was a prince, a statesman, a future king, driven by duty and intellect, not by sentimental passion. While the vision was not what her heart yearned for, it was undeniably a powerful insight. It revealed a man of purpose, a formidable leader, a truly intelligent individual. The raw, emotional desire she had felt for him began to transform into something different, something more intellectual and pragmatic. The visions from the gilded mirror did not show Isolde the path to passionate love, but they offered a different kind of understanding. They showed her that Prince Alaric was a man deeply committed to his realm, a shrewd and capable ruler. This understanding shifted her perspective. She began to see the proposed political alliance, not merely as a family obligation, but as an opportunity to join forces with a genuinely impressive individual. Her family, through their network of spies and informants, soon received detailed reports confirming Alaric's political acumen and his strategic importance. The intelligence aligned perfectly with the visions Isolde had witnessed in the mirror. He was indeed a valuable partner, a necessary ally in the volatile landscape of medieval European politics. Armed with this newfound insight, Isolde approached her family with a strategic shift in her demeanor. She no longer spoke of Alaric with youthful infatuation, but with an intelligent understanding of his political value. She spoke of the advantages of the alliance, not just for land and titles, but for the stability and prosperity it would bring to both kingdoms. Her arguments were well-reasoned, pragmatic, demonstrating a maturity beyond her years. She discussed the strategic placement of their combined forces, the economic benefits of shared trade routes, and the long-term peace that could be achieved. Her parents, initially surprised by her sudden grasp of jilting strategy, were deeply impressed. This was not the dreamy girl who longed for romance. This was a future queen, capable of understanding and contributing to the weighty affairs of state. The marriage contract was eventually drawn up, and Isolde and Alaric were wed in a grand ceremony that sealed the alliance between their two kingdoms. Their union was, as expected, a political one. There were no declarations of passionate love, no grand romantic gestures from Alaric. Their relationship was built on mutual respect, shared intellectual interests, and a common understanding of their duties to their people. They discussed state affairs, debated philosophies, and worked together to secure their borders. Isolde found a different kind of fulfillment in this partnership. She admired Alaric's intelligence and dedication, and he in turn respected her keen mind and her strategic contributions. Their bond, though not born of a love spell, was a strong one, forged in shared purpose and intellectual companionship. The gilded mirror had not given her the love she initially craved, but it had given her a valuable truth, redirecting her desire into a powerful, pragmatic alliance that benefited both kingdoms and herself. The magic intended for romantic gain instead yielded a political success, proving that sometimes what you get is not what you seek, but what you truly need. Number 7. The Widow's Last Hope. Lady Beatrice, a widow of 53 years, resided in a quiet, respectable town in the heart of 15th century England. Her life had been one of quiet dignity, defined first by her pious upbringing, then by her marriage to a moderately prosperous merchant who had specialized in wool. For 3 decades, she had managed their household with meticulous care, overseen the education of their now-grown children, and participated in the local guild's charitable works. Upon her husband's death 5 years prior, she inherited a comfortable sum, a sturdy house, and a small but reliable income from rents and investments. By all accounts, Beatrice was a woman of means, respected in her community and financially secure. Yet a gnawing loneliness had begun to settle in her heart. Her children had moved away, pursuing their own lives, and the once bustling house felt empty. The silence after years of companionship was a heavy cloak. Beatrice yearned for companionship, for the simple comfort of shared meals and conversation, for a hand to hold as she navigated the twilight years of her life. She was not seeking grand passion or a new husband to manage her affairs. Rather, she desired a gentle presence, someone with whom to share the quiet moments, a companion to ward off the chill of solitude. Her gaze in recent months had fallen upon a man named Master Godfrey, a traveling merchant who frequented their town, dealing in fine silks and spices from the East. Godfrey was younger than Beatrice, perhaps 40, with a charming smile, a ready wit, and an air of sophistication that set him apart from the local townsfolk. He always had a pleasant word for her, often complimenting her taste in fabric or her well-kept garden. His attention, however fleeting, sparked a fragile hope within Beatrice's aging heart. Medieval society held a complex view of widows. While respected for their experience, and often granted a degree of independence, especially if they inherited property, they were also seen as vulnerable. Unmarried women, regardless of their age, were often pressured to remarry either for financial security or social standing. Yet, for an older widow, finding a suitable match was challenging. Younger men often sought wealthy heiresses, while older men might seek younger wives. The market for companionship, for a woman of Beatrice's age, was slim, and the desire for a gentle connection often pushed such women to unconventional solutions. The fear of loneliness was a powerful motivator, sometimes overriding caution and good judgment. Beatrice, a woman of deep faith, initially dismissed the idea of seeking outside help for her emotional needs, but as her loneliness deepened and Godfrey's visits continued to stir her quiet longing, she recalled whispers of a certain wise woman in a nearby village, a woman named Agnes, who was said to possess remedies for all manner of ailments, including those of the heart. Agnes was not a witch, not in the demonic sense, but a practitioner of traditional folk magic, mixing herbal remedies with charms and incantations. Such cunning folk were often the last resort for those facing intractable problems, balancing between accepted herbalism and condemned sorcery. Beatrice, in her quiet desperation, felt the pull of this forbidden path growing stronger. One crisp autumn morning, under the pretense of visiting a distant cousin, Beatrice journeyed to Agnes's cottage. The wise woman, her face etched with a lifetime of experience, listened patiently to Beatrice's tale of loneliness and her quiet admiration for Godfrey. Agnes, sensing Beatrice's vulnerability, offered a sympathetic nod. She explained that true love could not be forced, but affection could be encouraged. She offered a charm of attraction, a potent mixture of herbs and minerals to be infused into wine and given to Godfrey. Agnes instructed Beatrice to gather specific items: a piece of Godfrey's clothing, a lock of her own hair, and a handful of dirt from his footsteps, all believed to hold sympathetic connections to the target. She also gave Beatrice a small, intricately carved wooden heart, telling her to carry it always as a token of her intent. Beatrice returned home with a small bag of potent herbs and the wooden heart. Her mind buzzing with a cautious excitement, she carefully followed Agnes's instructions. She retrieved a discarded silk handkerchief that Godfrey had inadvertently left behind during his last visit and carefully cut a small piece from it. She snipped a few strands of her own gray hair. The dirt from his footsteps was more challenging, but she managed to discreetly collect a small handful from the path outside his usual lodging. She ground the herbs, the cloth, the hair, and the dirt into a fine powder with a stone mortar and pestle, as Agnes had instructed, murmuring the simple incantations the wise woman had taught her. She then carefully infused the powder into a bottle of her finest red wine, stirring it slowly and purposefully, her heart beating with a nervous hope. The opportunity to offer Godfrey the wine arose during his next visit to town. He stopped by Beatrice's house, as was his custom, to exchange pleasantries and share news from the trade routes. Beatrice, feigning a casual hospitality, offered him a glass of her special wine. "A vintage I've been saving for a pleasant occasion," she said, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. Godfrey, always gracious, accepted with a warm smile, praising the wine's richness and flavor. Beatrice watched him drink, her breath held tight in her chest. Had it worked? Would he feel the subtle shift in his heart, the gentle tug of affection? She tried to read his expression, searching for any sign of change. He finished the glass, thanked her, and promised to call upon her again before he left town. In the days that followed, Beatrice observed a subtle yet distinct change in Godfrey's behavior. He began to seek her out more frequently, his visits growing longer. He would linger over conversation, asking about her day, sharing anecdotes from his travels. He spoke of her gentle spirit, her wisdom, her comfortable home. He admired her garden, complimented her cooking, and seemed to genuinely enjoy her company. He started bringing her small, thoughtful gifts. A rare spice, a length of fine silk, a carved wooden bird. Beatrice's heart swelled with a cautious joy. The spell, she believed, was working. It wasn't a sudden, overwhelming passion, but a gentle, growing affection. Exactly what she had hoped for. The loneliness began to recede, replaced by a warm sense of companionship. As Godfrey's affections seemed to grow, so did his interest in Beatrice's financial affairs. He began subtly at first to offer advice on her investments. He spoke of new opportunities, of profitable ventures in far-off lands, of ways to make her comfortable income grow. He painted a picture of a more luxurious life, a secure future where they could travel together, free from worry. He was charming, persuasive, and seemed to have her best interests at heart. He spoke of his own wealth, of successful ventures that had made him a man of considerable means. Beatrice, her judgment clouded by her desire for companionship and her growing affection for him, listened intently. She valued his business acumen and trusted his apparent affection. He never asked for money outright, but rather suggested investments that would require her to draw upon her principal. Beatrice, convinced by Godfrey's charm and what she perceived as his genuine affection, began to invest her money at his suggestion. She withdrew funds from her established accounts, sold off small parcels of land, and entrusted the proceeds to Godfrey for his grand ventures. Presented her with impressive-looking documents, promissory notes, and contracts, all meticulously drawn up, though she, being unversed in such legal intricacies, did not scrutinize them closely. She trusted him implicitly, believing that his efforts were for their shared future. She even began to consider the possibility of a future marriage, a comfortable, companionable union that would banish her loneliness forever. She was so caught up in the promise of affection and security that she failed to notice the subtle inconsistencies in his stories, the vague answers to specific questions, or the way he always seemed to need just a little more money. The truth began to unravel with agonizing slowness. Godfrey's visits became less frequent, his excuses more elaborate. The promised returns on her investments never materialized. Her initial inquiries were met with reassuring smiles and promises of soon. Then, one day, he simply did not arrive. Weeks turned into months and Godfrey vanished without a trace. Beatrice, gripped by a terrible dread, sought legal counsel. Her lawyers, after careful investigation, delivered the devastating news. Godfrey was a con artist, a master manipulator, who had preyed on vulnerable women throughout the region. The impressive documents he had shown her were worthless, the investments entirely fictitious. Her fortune, once comfortable and secure, was gone. She was left with only her house and a meager allowance from her children, who were shocked and dismayed by their mother's ruin. Beatrice, once a respected widow of means, was now destitute. The comfortable life she had built was shattered, her trust betrayed. The love spell intended to bring her companionship and affection had instead opened the door for a cunning predator. The wooden heart Agnes had given her, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a bitter mockery. She was left with not only the pain of financial ruin, but the crushing weight of her own naivety. Fueled by the desperate desire for companionship, the wise woman Agnes had warned that magic was unpredictable, but Beatrice had been too blinded by her longing to heed the warning. The spell had seemed to work, had attracted Godfrey, but the affection it brought was not genuine. It was a carefully constructed facade, designed to exploit her. Her last hope had been brutally exploited, leaving her with nothing but the chilling silence of an empty house and the crushing burden of a future she had never foreseen. Number 6. The scholarly charm. Thomas, a young scholar in the bustling university town of Oxford in the late 14th century, was a man of books and contemplation. His days were spent in the hushed libraries, poring over ancient manuscripts, debating philosophy, and mastering Latin and Greek. He dreamed of a life dedicated to learning, perhaps even becoming a renowned professor or a respected churchman. However, despite his keen intellect, Thomas possessed a rather awkward social demeanor, blushed easily, stumbled over words when nervous, and felt utterly lost in the more refined social circles of Oxford, particularly those frequented by the town's elite. He was a brilliant mind trapped in a socially anxious frame. His heart, quite unexpectedly, had been captured by Lady Eleanor, the daughter of a powerful patron of the university, a wealthy merchant who influenced many academic appointments. Eleanor was known for her intelligence, her keen interest in learned discourse, and her refined beauty. She often attended public lectures, her presence a quiet but compelling force in the lecture hall. Thomas, who often saw her there, was utterly captivated. He admired her wit, her thoughtful questions, and the way her eyes would light up when a complex philosophical point was debated. She was everything. He was not graceful, poised and confident. He longed to speak to her, to engage her in intellectual discussion, but his shyness rendered him mute in her presence. He knew that impressing Eleanor, and by extension her influential father, could open doors to his academic ambitions, but his social ineptitude was a formidable barrier. Medieval universities, while centers of learning, were also microcosms of society, reflecting its hierarchies and superstitions. Alongside the rigorous study of theology, law, and medicine, there was a quiet, almost subterranean interest in astrology and other forms of divination. Scholars, particularly those interested in natural philosophy, would sometimes dabble in practices that blurred the line between science and magic. Ancient texts on celestial influences, planetary alignments, and the sympathetic properties of stones and herbs were studied often with a mix of genuine intellectual curiosity and a desire to harness hidden forces. While the Church condemned outright sorcery, astrological predictions and natural magic were often tolerated. Especially presented as a form of learned inquiry rather than demonic invocation. Thomas, in his desperation, turned to an old eccentric scholar named Master Alaric, a man rumored to possess knowledge far beyond the conventional curriculum. Alaric lived in a cluttered room above a bookbinder's shop, surrounded by stacks of ancient tomes and astrological charts. He was known for his vast, if sometimes unorthodox learning. Thomas had heard whispers that Alaric dabbled in celestial influences and had helped others with their personal dilemmas through the application of arcane knowledge. With much trepidation, Thomas sought out Master Alaric, confessing his predicament, his admiration for Lady Eleanor, and his inability to approach her. Alaric, stroking his long gray beard, listened with a knowing glint in his eye. Master Alaric, after much contemplation, proposed a scholarly charm, an astrological and herbal concoction designed not to force love, but to enhance one's appeal to an intellectual peer. He explained that it would create an aura of intellectual magnetism, drawing Eleanor's mind, not her heart, towards him. He instructed Thomas to gather specific ingredients, a piece of parchment inscribed with celestial symbols for Venus and Mercury, signifying love and intellect, powdered mandrake root, believed to enhance attraction in folklore. A quill feather from a raven for wisdom and knowledge, and a fragment of lodestone, thought to possess magnetic properties. The ritual involved grinding the ingredients, mixing them with a drop of Thomas's own ink, and then infusing the resulting powder into a small, intricately carved wooden amulet, which Thomas was to wear discreetly beneath his scholar's robe. The charm, Elara emphasized, was for intellectual connection, not carnal. Desire aligning with Thomas's own aspirations. Thomas meticulously followed Master Elaric's instructions. He spent hours carefully drawing the astrological symbols onto the parchment, ensuring each line was precise. He ground the mandrake root, a difficult task given its fibrous nature, until it was a fine, potent powder. He retrieved a raven's feather from the university courtyard and carefully shaved a sliver from a lodestone, a heavy, dark rock that felt cool and solid in his hand. He mixed the ingredients with a drop of the black ink he used for his scholarly notes, feeling a strange blend of ancient ritual and academic endeavor. Finally, he carefully placed the mixture into the hollowed-out center of the small wooden amulet which Elara had provided, and sealed it with wax. He fastened it to a thin leather cord and placed it around his neck, letting it rest against his skin beneath his tunic. A secret weight of hope and apprehension. For a few days, Thomas noticed no change. He still stammered, still avoided eye contact with Lady Eleanor when she was present. He began to fear the charm had failed, that his social awkwardness was too great even for celestial influence. Then, a subtle shift began. During a public debate on the nature of free will, a topic Thomas had extensively researched, Lady Eleanor, who was in the audience, caught his eye. Instead of looking away, she offered a small, encouraging nod. Later, as he was leaving the lecture hall, she approached him. "Master Thomas," she said, her voice clear and intelligent, "I found your points on Aquinas' perspective most illuminating." Thomas, surprised but buoyed, managed to engage her in a brief, albeit still clumsy, discussion. This small breakthrough was enough to ignite a spark of confidence in him. The charm, he thought, was subtly working, drawing her intellectual attention. Over the next few weeks, the scholarly charm seemed to intensify its effect. Lady Eleanor began seeking out Thomas for intellectual conversations. She would approach him after lectures, or even send her attendant to invite him to discuss philosophical texts in the university gardens. She admired his deep knowledge, his unique interpretations of complex theories, and his unwavering dedication to learning. She found his quiet intensity intriguing, a refreshing contrast to the boisterous, often superficial conversations of other young men. Thomas, for his part, found himself surprisingly articulate when discussing matters of the mind with Eleanor. His shyness seemed to dissipate when the conversation turned to his true passion. He felt her drawing closer, not with romantic overtures, but with a genuine interest in his thoughts and scholarly pursuits. His confidence grew bolstered by her respectful attention. Lady Eleanor's interest in Thomas, however, remained purely intellectual. She found his mind fascinating, his insights profound, but she saw him as a fellow scholar, a potential intellectual partner. She spoke of collaborating on a translation, of discussing new philosophical theories, of him perhaps tutoring her younger brother in Latin. She often expressed her admiration for his dedication to study, seeing him as a promising academic with a bright future in the university. Her affection, if it could be called, that was one of profound intellectual respect, admiration for his capabilities. She saw him as a conduit to greater knowledge, a valuable resource in her own intellectual journey. Thomas, however, misread her intentions. He interpreted her intellectual closeness as a burgeoning romantic attachment, a subtle form of courtship. He believed the charm was gently fanning the flames of love, albeit a slow-burning one. He began to plan his future with her, envisioning not just scholarly collaboration, but a quiet intellectual marriage, a partnership of minds and hearts. The true nature of Lady Eleanor's intentions became painfully clear during a private meeting in her father's study. Thomas, emboldened by what he perceived as their deepening bond, had planned to subtly express his growing affection. Eleanor, however, had a very different purpose. "Master Thomas," she began, her eyes sparkling with enthusiasm, "my father and I have been most impressed with your scholarly contribution. We believe you have a remarkable mind, and we wish to support your future endeavors. But then," she continued, "my father wishes to offer you a generous patronage, a stipend to support your research in writing and tutor to my younger brother. This would free you from financial worries and allow you to pursue your great work unhindered." The words hit Thomas with the force of a cold wave. Patronage, librarian, tutor, all noble positions, vital for a scholar, but utterly devoid of any romantic implication. Eleanor, seeing his crestfallen expression, seemed to misunderstand. "You appear surprised, Master Thomas. Is this not to your liking?" she asked, a slight frown creasing her brow. Thomas stammered, trying to compose himself. He quickly realized the full extent of his misinterpretation. The charm had worked perfectly, but not in the way he desired. It had amplified his intellectual appeal, making him irresistible to Eleanor's scholarly mind. But it had done nothing for her heart. He had successfully attracted her, but only as a colleague, a resource, a valued intellect. His dream of a romantic union shattered, replaced by the stark reality of a platonic, though highly advantageous professional relationship. Thomas accepted the patronage, his heart a strange mix of profound disappointment and pragmatic understanding. He became Lady Eleanor's father's personal librarian, a position of great prestige and security for a scholar. He had access to a vast collection of books, ample time for research, and the respect of his peers. He and Eleanor continued their intellectual discussions, sometimes late into the night, their minds connecting on a profound level. But the deep, yearning affection he harbored for her remained unrequited, unseen by her. The scholarly charm had, in a way, been a success. It had drawn Eleanor to him, and it had advanced his career beyond his wildest dreams. He was no longer a struggling, awkward scholar. He was a respected, intellectual, financially secure, and deeply engaged in his passion. Yet the price was the crushing weight of unspoken desires. The spell had brought him what he needed for his career, but not what his heart truly longed for. A bitter irony for a man of such profound thought. He had gained a patron, but lost a dream, a testament to the unpredictable nature of magic even when applied with the most learned of intentions. Number 5. The Baker's Bitter Loaf. Agnes, the baker's wife, was a woman of sturdy build and tireless energy, her hands perpetually dusted with flour. Her days in the bustling 13th century market town were a ceaseless rhythm of kneading dough, stoking the brick oven, and selling fragrant loaves from their shop on the main thoroughfare. Her husband, Master Robert, was a skilled baker, renowned for his crusty bread and sweet pastries. Together, they had built a prosperous business, and their shop was a cornerstone of the community. They had 2 strapping sons and a clever daughter, and by all outward appearances their life was one of comfortable domesticity. Yet beneath the surface of flour and warmth, Agnes carried a growing resentment. Robert, while a good provider, possessed a roving eye. His jovial nature and easy charm made him popular with the customers, particularly the younger, prettier women who frequented the market. Agnes had noticed the lingering glances, the extra compliments, the unnecessary chatter with other women, all accompanied by Robert's hearty laugh. Each flirtatious exchange, each prolonged conversation chipped away at Agnes's peace of mind. Her heart ached with a familiar jealousy, and she grew increasingly frustrated by Robert's perceived lack of attention to her, his true partner in life and business. She longed for his undivided affection, for the warmth and intimacy that seemed to have faded from their marriage, replaced by the daily grind and his casual flirtations. In medieval towns, gossip was as common as the cobblestones. Whispers about unhappy marriages, straying spouses, and the various remedies sought to mend them were a constant hum. While the church frowned upon any form of magic, practical solutions, often blurring into folk remedies, were widely sought, especially for domestic woes. Women would consult older, experienced matrons, sometimes known as wise women or cunning wives, for advice on everything from difficult childbirth to disobedient children. These wise women often offered charms, herbal concoctions, or ritualistic practices, often involving food, to influence behavior or restore harmony. The belief was that food being ingested could directly influence the body, and by extension the spirit of the consumer. This made food-based charms a common, if risky, approach for domestic problems. Agnes, driven by a desperate desire to reclaim her husband's full attention, secretly sought out Martha, an elderly woman who lived on the outskirts of town, known for her knowledge of herbs and old family recipes, some of which were whispered to have magical properties. Martha, with her knowing eyes and perpetually stained apron, listened patiently to Agnes's woe. She understood the plight of a wife whose husband's affection seemed to wander. Martha agreed to help, but warned Agnes that such spells were delicate, and their effects could be unpredictable. She offered Agnes a special blend of powdered herbs, primarily vervain, believed to promote love and fidelity, and mugwort for protection against ill will, along with a dried toad heart, a common, if unsettling, ingredient in medieval love charms, believed to bind affection through its symbolic connection to the heart. This mixture, Martha instructed, was to be secretly baked into a loaf of bread which Robert must consume. Agnes returned to her bustling bakery, the small, potent package clutched tightly in her hand. She waited for a day when Robert was distracted with a large order for the local monastery, leaving her to manage the daily bake. With trembling hands, she kneaded the dough for Robert's favorite morning loaf, a hearty rye bread he consumed daily. As she worked, she carefully incorporated the powdered herbs and the dried toad heart, crumbling it finely so it would be undetectable. The scent of the herbs was earthy, mingling strangely with the yeasty aroma of the rising dough. She whispered the incantations Martha had taught her, words of binding and devotion, as she folded the mixture into the sticky mass. She shaped the loaf with extra care, envisioning Robert eating it, his eyes filled with love for her, his wandering gaze finally fixed. The next morning, Robert, oblivious, sliced into the freshly baked rye loaf. He took a large bite, his usual morning ritual. Agnes watched him, her heart hammering in her chest. She waited for a sign, any sign. After his first bite, Robert chewed slowly, a puzzled expression on his face. He took another bite, then paused. "Agnes," he said, his brow furrowed, "this bread tastes odd." He took another small bite and pushed the plate away. "No, it's not bright. It's bitter." Agnes's heart sank. She tried to insist. It was the usual, but Robert shook his head, a faint look of disgust on his face. He avoided the bread for the rest of the morning, opting instead for a piece of cheese. Over the next few days, the unexpected consequences of the charm began to unfold. Robert developed a profound, inexplicable aversion to bread, especially the rye bread he had once loved. He would eye the loaves on their shelves with suspicion, and the smell of fresh baking, once his greatest joy, now seemed to trigger a mild nausea. He even started to avoid Agnes herself. Her presence seemed to cause him discomfort, a strange tension that settled between them. He would make excuses to be out of the shop, spending more time at the tavern or visiting suppliers, anything to avoid the bakery and his wife. The charm intended to bind him to her, and her baking had instead created an unnatural repulsion. The strange aversion to bread and Agnes began to affect their business. Robert, the master baker, could no longer properly taste or evaluate his own products. His passion for baking, once the driving force of their livelihood, dwindled. He grew irritable and distracted, and his once charming demeanor soured. Customers began to notice the decline in his enthusiasm, and consequently, the slight but perceptible drop in the quality of the bread. Some whispered about him being off his feed. Others joked he'd lost his taste for life. The joy he once found in his craft was gone, replaced by a sullen apathy. Sales began to drop, slowly at first, then more rapidly. The growing financial difficulties strained Agnes and Robert's marriage to breaking point. The arguments became more frequent, laced with accusations and bitter recriminations. Agnes, knowing the true source of his affliction, was tormented by guilt and helplessness. She wanted to confess, to explain, but fear of Robert's wrath and the public shame of admitting to a love charm held her back. Robert, bewildered by his own strange aversion and his deteriorating passion for baking, blamed Agnes for his unhappiness, for the general decline of their business, for everything that seemed to be going wrong. The once vibrant bakery, a symbol of their shared life, became a source of contention and misery. The economic impact on their family was devastating. Without Robert's dedication and skill, the bakery began to fail. Customers, finding alternatives elsewhere, dwindled to a trickle. They could no longer afford to pay their apprentices, and their sons, seeing the collapse of the family trade, began to seek work elsewhere. Agnes, desperate, tried to take on more of the baking herself, but she lacked Robert's touch, his mastery. Their savings dwindled, and the threat of losing their shop became a terrifying reality. The charm meant to fix their marriage and restore his affection had inadvertently led to their financial ruin, dismantling the very foundation of their life. In the end, the baker's shop was sold, their family scattered. Robert, still afflicted by his inexplicable aversion to bread, never truly regained his passion for his craft. He drifted from job to job, a shadow of his former self. Agnes, consumed by guilt, lived with the bitter knowledge that her desperate act had not only failed to win back her husband's affection, but had destroyed their entire life. The love spell, intended to bring sweetness to their marriage, had instead poisoned it with bitterness and ruin, a stark reminder that even the simplest of charms could have the most unpredictable and destructive consequences. Number 4. The Knight's Unwanted Devotion. Lady Genevieve was a woman of sharp wit and refined elegance, a fixture in the elaborate court of King Edward in the late 14th century. She moved through the grand halls with an air of understated confidence, admired by many for her intelligence and beauty. Her life, however, was tightly circumscribed by the expectations of her noble lineage and the intricate dance of courtly politics. She was expected to make a strategic marriage, to produce heirs, and to maintain her family's standing. Her heart, though, held a secret longing for a love that transcended mere alliance, a passion that matched the romantic tales sung by the court's troubadours. Sir Alistair, a valiant knight known throughout the realm for his prowess in jousting, his unwavering loyalty, and his strict adherence to the code of chivalry, was the object of Genevieve's fervent admiration. He was the epitome of a medieval hero, strong, honorable, and fiercely dedicated to his duties. He had distinguished himself in several skirmishes along the border, earning the king's favor and the admiration of all who witnessed his courage. Genevieve found herself drawn to his stoic strength, his quiet integrity, and the flash of intelligence in his eyes. She dreamt of him performing great deeds in her name, of him pledging his undying devotion. She, like many ladies of her time, cultivated an image of courtly love, but she truly believed in the ideal. However, despite her subtle attempts to gain his attention, a prolonged glance, a soft remark, a gesture of admiration for his accomplishments, Sir Alistair remained stubbornly detached. He was polite, always respectful, but his attention seemed entirely consumed by his military duties, his training, and his commitment to the king. He treated all ladies of the court with equal deference, never singling out Genevieve for special notice. His heart, it seemed, was entirely given to his knightly vows, leaving no room for courtly affections. Genevieve, accustomed to admiration, felt a keen sting of rejection, a growing frustration with his impenetrable reserve. His indifference, rather than dampening her desire, only intensified it, turning her longing into a desperate need. Courtly love, while idealized in literature, often existed alongside a shadowy underworld of practical magic. Desperate lovers, frustrated by the unyielding hearts of their desired ones, often sought the help of wise women or traveling charlatans who claimed to possess potent love philters. These philters were often concoctions of rare herbs, animal parts, and strange minerals, sometimes mixed with more mundane ingredients like wine or honey. The belief was that by consuming the potion, the target would be subtly influenced, their affections skewed towards the giver. These practices, though condemned by the Church as witchcraft, were a pervasive undercurrent in medieval society, particularly among those with enough wealth and desperation to seek them out. Genevieve, hearing whispers of a renowned, wise woman named Isolde, who traveled from fair to fair and was said to specialize in matters of the heart, resolved to seek her out. Isolde, a woman with piercing eyes and a reputation for potent if risky remedies, was rumored to possess love. Philters of extraordinary power. Genevieve found her at a bustling autumn fair, hidden among the stalls selling exotic spices and carved trinkets. With a carefully crafted tale of a persistent ailment, Genevieve managed to secure a private audience. She confessed her yearning for Sir Alistair and her frustration with his unyielding heart. Isolde listened, her gaze unblinking. She warned Genevieve of the dangers of such strong magic, explaining that the philter would not merely evoke affection, but could stir a love so powerful it might become all-consuming. But Genevieve, blinded by her desire, dismissed the warnings, focusing only on the promise of Alistair's devotion. Isolde provided Genevieve with a small, stoppered vial containing a dark, viscous liquid that shimmered faintly in the light. It smelled faintly of musk and something else, something earthy and potent. She instructed Genevieve to subtly administer the philter to Sir Alistair, preferably in a drink. He would consume entirely. The dose had to be precise, Isolde warned, as too much could lead to unforeseen imbalances. Genevieve planned her moment carefully. During a grand feast at court, she managed to pour a few drops of the philter into Sir Alistair's goblet of wine, while his attention was diverted by a boisterous jester. Her hand trembled slightly as the dark liquid swirled into the ruby wine, but she composed herself, her heart thudding with a mixture of fear and triumph. Initially, nothing seemed to change. Sir Alistair remained his stoic, chivalrous self. Genevieve felt a pang of despair, fearing the philter had failed or that his noble heart was truly impervious to such magic. Then subtle changes began. Alistair's gaze, once distant, began to linger on Genevieve. He sought her out in the court, his conversation shifting from polite formality to quiet inquiries about her well-being, her interests. He offered small, courteous gestures, fetching her a cushion, holding a door, complimenting her gown. Genevieve's heart soared. The philter was working. He was noticing her truly. Seeing her and the attention he gave her felt like a precious balm to her long-held longing. This initial shift, though slight, confirmed her belief in the philter's power, and she eagerly anticipated the full flowering of his affection. However, the philter's influence did not stop at mere affection or polite interest. Sir Alistair's devotion escalated rapidly, becoming intense, overwhelming, and utterly obsessive. He became a constant presence at Genevieve's side, shadowing her every move. He would follow her, like a faithful hound, his eyes fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. He began to neglect his nightly duties, missing training sessions, arriving late for council meetings, and even abandoning his post during important court functions, all for the sake of being near Genevieve. His fellow knights, once admiring, began to eye him with concern, then with disdain. His once impeccable armor lay unpolished, his sword unsharpened, his mind consumed entirely by Genevieve. His obsession alienated him from his peers and more dangerously from the king. Sir Alistair, once a paragon of chivalry and loyalty, began to priorize Genevieve above all else. He challenged anyone who spoke to her, interpreting innocent conversation as a slight. He grew jealous of her other acquaintances, even her female friends. His conversations became dominated by grand, often illogical declarations of love and devotion, which, while initially flattering, soon became suffocating. He lost his sharp wit, his strategic mind, and his very sense of self, becoming a mere shadow of the valiant knight he once was. Consumed entirely by this unnatural, potent love. The court whispered about his madness, attributing it to a sudden illness or a dark melancholy. King, a pragmatic ruler, could not ignore the decline of one of his most valued knights. Sir Alistair's erratic behavior, his neglect of duties, and his public displays of bizarre affection became a liability. He was no longer fit for military command or advisory roles. The king, known for his stern justice, stripped Alistair of his titles and lands, banishing him from court. His knightly honors were rescinded, his reputation in tatters. Sir Alistair, once a celebrated hero, was reduced to a desolate, heartbroken wanderer, his mind still fixated on Genevieve, who now found herself trapped by his desperate, unwanted devotion. Alistair's public downfall and his obsessive behavior stained her own reputation. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Some suggested she was a sorceress, having bewitched a noble knight. Others pitied her, recognizing the tragic consequences of Alistair's inexplicable madness. She was avoided by other ladies of the court, her once gilded social standing tarnished. The passion she had so desperately sought had materialized, but it was a twisted, destructive force that consumed Alistair and ruined her own life. The love philter, intended to bring her a glorious romance, had instead brought public shame and private misery, a chilling lesson in the unforeseen power of desperate magic. Number 3. The monk's forbidden brew. Brother Gabriel was a man of quiet devotion, a diligent scribe, within the hallowed walls of a Benedictine monastery in 12th century. His days were spent in the scriptorium, meticulously copying ancient texts, illuminating manuscripts with intricate designs, and preserving the knowledge of ages. He was a devout man, committed to his vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. His life was one of prayer, study, and the rhythmic contemplation of divine mysteries. The monastery was his world, its routines, his comfort, its silent halls a sanctuary from the complexities of the outside world. Yet even within the monastery's sacred confines, human desires could stir. A new laundress, a young woman named Isolde, had recently been employed by the monastery. She was not a beauty of legend, but she possessed a vibrant energy, a bright laugh, and a quiet grace that resonated deeply with Gabriel's secluded heart. He would occasionally glimpse her as she went about her duties, her sleeves rolled up, her arms strong from lifting heavy linens. Her presence, a stark contrast to the solemnity of monastic life, stirred a forbidden yearning within him. He found himself thinking of her during prayers, his mind drifting from sacred verses to the image of her sun-kissed hair. His vow of chastity, once an unquestioned part of his identity, became a heavy burden, a constant reminder of the profound separation between his sacred life and his earthly desires. In the medieval period, monasteries were not merely religious institutions, but also centers of learning, preserving texts, both sacred and secular, within their vast libraries, alongside theological treatises. One might occasionally find texts on natural philosophy, alchemy, and even in rare and illicit cases, works that touched upon magic or divination. These forbidden grimoires, often copied in secret or smuggled in from distant lands, contained knowledge that was deeply controversial, seen by the church as dangerous and demonic. Yet their very forbidden nature often made them alluring to curious or desperate minds, offering solutions beyond the realm of prayer or conventional wisdom. One late night, consumed by his growing desire for Isolde, Gabriel stumbled upon a dusty, leather-bound grimoire, hidden in a forgotten corner of the monastery's vast library. It was a text on sympathetic magic, detailing various charms and potions, among them a powerful love philter. The book was old, its pages brittle, its script archaic. But Gabriel, with his scribe's eye, slowly deciphered its dangerous contents. The grimoire promised to stir profound affection in the heart of the desired one, using specific herbs, celestial alignments, and carefully chanted incantations. Gabriel knew deep in his soul that reading such a book, let alone attempting its rituals, was a grave sin, a direct transgression against his vows and the teachings of the Church. But his yearning for Isolde, a longing that felt unbearable, pushed him to consider the unthinkable. Gabriel resolved to brew the forbidden philtre. He meticulously transcribed the recipe, his hand shaking slightly as he copied the archaic symbols and potent ingredients. The grimoire called for specific herbs, some mundane, some rare and potent. Morwen for love, and a highly poisonous plant called nightshade, known for its hallucinogenic properties, to be used in minute quantities, believed to stir the senses. It also required a single drop of the caster's blood and a piece of cloth from the desired one's garments. The ritual demanded brewing the concoction under a specific planetary alignment, a careful process of heating and stirring. Gabriel, a scholar of ancient texts, found himself applying his intellectual rigor to a dangerously unholy pursuit. Over several clandestine nights, Gabriel collected the ingredients. He foraged for herbs in the monastery's garden, carefully extracting tiny droplets of nightshade from a hidden plant he knew grew in a forgotten corner. He pricked his finger for a drop of his own blood. Obtaining a piece of Isolde's cloth proved difficult, but during one of her rare trips to the well, he managed to snip a tiny thread from her hem as she bent to draw water, his heart pounding in his chest. He prepared the brew in a small, hidden crucible over a makeshift fire in a deserted cellar, carefully following the grimoire's instructions. Concoction bubbled and frothed, emitting a strange, earthy aroma mixed with something acrid. He chanted the ancient incantations under his breath, his voice barely a whisper, a stark contrast to the sacred Latin he usually recited. The moment he completed the brew, a potent dark liquid, he felt a strange sense of power mixed with a chilling dread. Gabriel's plan was to add a few drops of the philtre to Isolde's evening meal, which was brought to her from the monastery kitchens. He managed this one evening, his hand steady despite his inner turmoil as he delivered a small portion of bread and stew to her. Isolde, unsuspecting, consumed the meal. Gabriel watched her expectantly, his heart a mix of fear and fervent hope. He waited for a sign, a change in her demeanor, a lingering glance, anything to indicate the potion had taken hold. The next day, and the day after, Isolde remained the same. Cheerful, efficient, and entirely oblivious to Gabriel's desperate affections. A cold despair began to settle in Gabriel's chest. Had the spell failed? Had his unholy act been for naught? Perhaps the forbidden nature of the magic had rendered it impotent. Days passed, and Gabriel experienced no apparent effect on Isolde. He assumed the philtre had failed, perhaps due to his own spiritual unworthiness or a flaw in his execution. He grew increasingly despondent, his forbidden desire for Isolde, still burning but now tinged with the bitter taste of failure and sin. He returned to his duties in the scriptorium, his once clear mind now clouded with guilt and frustration. The mundane tasks of copying texts felt hollow, his prayers mechanical. He began to feel a strange creeping unease, a subtle disorientation. His sleep became restless, haunted by fragmented dreams. He attributed it to his guilty conscience, the burden of his transgression weighing heavily on his soul. Then the full terrifying effects of the nightshade, even in minute quantities, began to manifest. Instead of affecting Isolde, the remnants of the philtre in Gabriel's own body, perhaps through lingering contact on his hands or an accidental inhalation of its fumes, began to cause potent hallucinations. The intricate illuminations in the manuscripts he was copying seemed to shift and writhe, morphing into demonic faces. The voices of the other monks in the scriptorium twisted into accusatory whispers. He saw shadowy figures lurking in the corners of his vision, their eyes burning with a malevolent light. The hallowed walls of the monastery seemed to press in on him, suffocating him with their piety. The tranquil sanctuary turned into a terrifying labyrinth of his own tormented mind. The hallucinations grew more vivid, more terrifying. Gabriel's devout mind, already burdened by guilt, interpreted these visions as divine punishment, as the manifestation of the demonic forces he had dared to invoke. He saw fiery pits opening beneath the monastery floor, felt unseen hands clutching at his habit, heard the voices of the damned calling his name. His sleep provided no escape, only a deeper descent into madness. He became agitated, muttering to himself, his eyes wide with terror. His fellow monks noticed his strange behavior, his withdrawn nature, his sudden outbursts of fear. They attributed it to a fever, perhaps a demonic possession, and tried to help him with prayers and simple herbal remedies for his supposed ailment. One night, the hallucinations reached their peak. Gabriel, convinced he was surrounded by demons and on the verge of eternal damnation, could no longer contain his terror. He staggered from his cell, his eyes wild, and burst into the monastery's chapter house during the solemn pre-dawn matins. Before the assembled monks, before the abbot and his esteemed advisors, he began to shout, his voice raw with fear and confession. He confessed his forbidden love for Isolde, his sin in seeking a love charm, his use of the grimoire, every detail of the brew and the ingredients, including the nightshade and the toad heart. He described his terrifying visions, begging for absolution. Convinced that the demons were coming for his soul, the monastery was thrown into chaos. The abbot, a man of stern piety, was horrified. A monk, a scribe, a man of God, had dabbled in forbidden magic and succumbed to demonic influence. The scandal was immense, threatening the very sanctity of their monastic community. Gabriel was immediately confined to a solitary cell, not for his own protection, but to contain the spiritual contamination he represented. He was subjected to intense prayers, exorcisms, and a harsh regimen of fasting, all aimed at purging the demonic influence and punishing his grave transgression. His reputation, once spotless, was utterly destroyed. Was Ife as a scribe, as a monk, as a man of God. The forbidden brew, intended to win a laundress's heart, had instead stripped him of his sanity, his vows, and his very identity, leaving him a broken, publicly shamed man in a world that had once been his sacred sanctuary. Number 2. The Alchemist's Undoing. Lord Cedric, a wealthy merchant residing in a bustling port city in the mid-14th century, was a man of ambition. His warehouses overflowed with goods from distant lands, his ships plied the trade routes, and his coffers swelled with gold. He envisioned a future where his family transcended their merchant origins, securing a place among the landed gentry. His son, a rather pampered and impulsive young man named Elias, shared his father's ambition, but his desires were focused more acutely on personal conquest than dynastic advancement. Elias possessed a charm that was both beguiling and superficial, accustomed to having his desires met with ease. Elias, despite his father's considerable wealth, found himself increasingly enamored with Lady Arabella, the daughter of a powerful but financially struggling local noble. Arabella was known for her striking beauty, her icy composure, and her impeccable lineage. Her family, while impoverished, held considerable social standing, and a union with her would grant Elias the social legitimacy he craved. However, Arabella, fully aware of her family's precarious position, was determined to marry for genuine affection, or at the very least, mutual respect, not merely for money. She found Elias's superficial charm irritating, his attempts at flirtation cloying, and she consistently rebuffed his advances, despite his lavish gifts and persistent courtship. This rejection, a novel experience for Elias, inflamed his pride and transformed his desire into an obsessive need. In the medieval period, the line between science, philosophy, and magic was often blurred. Alchemy, though ostensibly a pursuit of transmuting base metals into gold, also encompassed a vast range of chemical and philosophical inquiries, some of which delved into the creation of elixirs, potions, and remedies for all manner of human conditions. Alchemists, often secretive and reclusive, were sought out by the wealthy and powerful, their skills promising everything from eternal youth to boundless riches. Some even claimed the ability to create potent love. Philters, believing that by manipulating the very essences of nature, they could influence human emotion. These dangerous practices, often involving volatile chemicals and dubious ingredients, were seen as highly effective by those desperate enough to try them. Elias, frustrated by Arabella's coldness, sought out a reclusive alchemist named Master Theron, whose reputation for powerful, if dangerous concoctions had reached his ears. Theron lived in a crumbling tower on the outskirts of the city, his laboratory filled with bubbling retorts, strange odors, and arcane symbols. Alias, driven by his desperate desire, offered a substantial sum of gold for a filter that would guarantee Arabella's affection. Theron, his eyes gleaming with avarice, agreed. He warned Alias that such a potent brew was not without risk, that it would bind Arabella's heart, irrevocably transforming her entire being. But Elias, convinced that such a powerful love was exactly what he wanted, dismissed the warnings, focusing only on the promise of Arabella's unwavering devotion. Master Theron, true to his word, produced a shimmering, iridescent liquid. Contained in a small, intricately carved glass vial, it was a potent concoction, a dangerous blend of rare, herbs-distilled animal essences, and highly reactive, volatile chemicals, all meticulously prepared over days of arcane rituals. He instructed Elias to administer the filter in a single small dose, warning him again of its overwhelming power. Elias, eager and impatient, planned his moment carefully. During a large feast hosted by his father, where Arabella was a guest, he managed to discreetly pour the entire contents of the vial into her goblet of wine. While her attention was diverted, he reasoned that a larger dose would ensure a stronger, faster effect, dismissing the alchemist's precise instructions in his eagerness. Within moments of consuming the wine, Lady Arabella began to change. Her usual composure shattered, replaced by an unsettling intensity. Her eyes, once cool and distant, now burned with an unnerving, feverish glow. She sought out Elias, her gaze fixated on him, her words tumbling out in a torrent of fervent declarations. Her affection for him, once non-existent, erupted into a terrifyingly possessive passion. She clung to him, refusing to let him out of her sight, her voice a constant murmur of devotion. The other guests at the feast watched with a mixture of shock and unease, accustomed to Arabella's refined demeanor, now witnessing this startling public transformation. The filter had worked, but its effects were terrifyingly absolute. Arabella's love for Elias was not merely intense, it was a consuming, pathological obsession. She became fiercely jealous, seeing rivals in every woman who dared to speak to him, interpreting innocent glances as treacherous designs. Her quiet grace vanished, replaced by violent outbursts of rage directed at anyone who approached Elias. She physically assaulted maids she suspected of looking at him, screamed at his male friends for daring to engage him in conversation, and even threatened his own family. Her once refined demeanor devolved into uncontrolled fury, driven by a desperate, insatiable need to possess Elias entirely. She could not bear to be separated from him even for a moment. Her constant presence a suffocating weight. Elias, who had yearned for Arabella's affection, now found himself a prisoner of her terrifying devotion. His initial triumph turned to horror as he realized the monster he had created. He tried to reason with her, to calm her, but she responded only with further outbursts of possessive rage. His life, once filled with lavish parties and carefree pursuits, became a nightmare of constant vigilance and fear. His social standing plummeted as his peers witnessed Arabella's alarming behavior and Elias's desperate attempts to control her. They whispered about madness, about a dark spell, about a judgment from God upon Elias's hubris. His father, Lord Cedric, was mortified, his dreams of a noble alliance shattered by the public spectacle of Arabella's derangement. The situation became unbearable. Arabella's outbursts grew more frequent, her jealousy more violent. Elias, trapped and terrified, eventually tried to flee from her, hoping to escape her suffocating grip. He attempted to slip away one night, planning to board one of his father's ships and sail to a distant city. But Arabella, driven by the filter's relentless hold, discovered his plan. In a fit of desperate, uncontrollable rage, convinced he was abandoning her, she attacked him with a knife she had hidden. Elias, unprepared for her violent fury, sustained a fatal wound. He died in his own courtyard, bleeding out under the cold moonlight, a victim of the very love he had so desperately sought to conjure. The aftermath was catastrophic. Arabella, found kneeling over Elias's body, still muttering fervent declarations of love amidst her tears, was immediately seized. Her family, devastated by the scandal and the loss of their daughter to such a public madness, were powerless to protect her. The authorities, convinced she was either insane or truly possessed by a demonic entity, subjected her to an immediate trial. In the medieval legal system, a woman in her state, especially one accused of such a heinous act, had little hope. She was found guilty and condemned to public execution. The alchemist Master Theron, learning of the tragic outcome, fled the city, his reputation shattered by the lethal consequences of his potent brew. The love philter intended to bring Elias noble affection had instead brought death and ruin, a chilling testament to the unpredictable and destructive power of forbidden magic, leaving behind a trail of sorrow and despair. Number 1. The Village Healer's Curse. Elara, a young peasant girl living in a small isolated village in the early 12th century, was a creature of the earth. Her hands were accustomed to the rough texture of straw and the damp soil of the fields. Her days were spent toiling alongside her family, her life a cycle of planting, harvesting, and praying for bountiful yields. Her future seemed predetermined: a marriage to a local farmer, a life of endless labor, and a brood of children. Yet, amidst the harsh realities of peasant life, Elara harbored a secret dream, a longing that defied the social strictures of her time. Her heart, quite unexpectedly, had been captivated by Lord Thomas, the youngest son of the local feudal lord. Thomas was a frequent visitor to the village, overseeing the lord's lands, collecting rents, and sometimes participating in local hunts. He was handsome, educated, and moved with an easy confidence that set him apart from the villagers. He represented a world of comfort, refinement, and opportunity that was utterly beyond Elara's reach. She knew, deep down, that a peasant girl could never hope to attract a nobleman's son, let alone marry one. But his kindness, a rare commodity from the nobility, and his occasional smile directed her way, had planted a seed of impossible hope in her young heart. She dreamt of a life beyond the fields, a life with him, a life she knew was pure fantasy. In medieval villages, folk magic was an integral part of daily life, intertwined with superstitions and traditional beliefs. Villagers, lacking access to educated physicians or formal legal systems, often relied on local cunning folk, wise women or village healers, for remedies and solutions to life's problems. These practitioners, often older women, possessed extensive knowledge of herbs, natural remedies, and ancient rituals, passed down through generations. They were sought out for everything from curing ailments to mending broken hearts, providing a crucial, if unofficial, service to the community. While the church actively condemned witchcraft and sorcery, village healers often existed in a gray area, tolerated for their practical utility, their practices often blurring the lines between accepted herbalism. Elara, driven by her desperate longing for Lord Thomas, secretly approached Agnes, the village healer. Agnes was an old woman, her face a rodet of wrinkles, her eyes holding the deep wisdom of the earth. She lived in a small smoke-filled cottage on the edge of the village, surrounded by drying herbs and strange talismans. Elara, her voice barely a whisper, confessed her forbidden desire for Lord Thomas and begged Agnes for a love spell. Agnes listened, her gaze steady. She warned Elara of the risks, explaining that such a powerful spell, especially one crossing social boundaries, could have unforeseen and dangerous consequences, that it might twist the intended outcome. But Elara, blinded by her hope, brushed aside the warnings, her focus fixed solely on winning Thomas's affection. Agnes, after much deliberation, agreed to help. She gave Elara a complex set of instructions for a traditional love spell, rooted in sympathetic magic. Elara was to gather specific ingredients: a sprig of rosemary for remembrance, a lock of her own hair for personal binding, and a piece of cloth from Lord Thomas's garment to establish a connection. She was also to obtain a fresh bird's heart, a common, if unsettling, ingredient in medieval love charms believed to bind love. These items were to be ground into a paste along with certain earth powders and then secretly rubbed onto Lord Thomas's most treasured possession, a small silver-handled hunting knife he carried. The ritual had to be performed under the waxing moon, with specific incantations whispered over the mixture. Elara diligently followed Agnes's intricate instructions. She carefully cut a lock of her own hair, its strands glinting faintly in the moonlight. Obtaining a piece of Lord Thomas's garment was a challenge, but she managed to snip a tiny thread from his cloak when he briefly left it unattended during a visit to the village mill. The most difficult task was acquiring a fresh bird's heart, but a local hunter, indebted to her family for some help with their harvest, provided her with a recently caught pigeon. She ground the ingredients with a stone mortar and pestle, her hands trembling as she mixed the raw heart with the herbs and earth, muttering the ancient words Agnes had taught her. Then, under the pale light of the waxing moon, she crept into the Lord's manor, gaining access through a loose shutter she knew of, and carefully rubbed the paste onto the handle of Lord Thomas's hunting knife, ensuring it was subtle enough to be invisible, yet potent enough to work. Lord Thomas continued his duties, his interactions with Elara remaining polite and distant. Elara's hope began to wane, replaced by a dull ache of disappointment. Had the spell failed? Had her desperate act been in vain? Then a subtle shift occurred. Lord Thomas, who had always been robust and energetic, began to complain of a strange malaise. He grew pale, his movements became lethargic, and his once keen eyes seemed clouded with a weariness that puzzled the manor physician. His family attributed it to a lingering cold or the changing seasons. Elara, however, felt a cold dread begin to creep into her heart. Had the spell worked, but in an unforeseen way? Over the next few weeks, Lord Thomas's condition worsened. He lost weight, his complexion became ashen, and he developed a persistent cough. He grew weaker by the day, unable to perform his duties, spending most of his time confined to his bed. The manor physician, baffled by his mysterious illness, tried various remedies, purges, bloodletting herbal poultices, but nothing seemed to alleviate his decline. Lord Thomas, once so vibrant, was now a mere shadow of his former self, his strength draining away with each passing day. The Lord and Lady, his parents, grew increasingly concerned, their faces etched with worry over their beloved son. The mystery of his illness began to spread through the manor and into the village, a source of hushed whispers and growing unease. The illness of Lord Thomas, a strong, healthy young man, without any discernible cause, began to arouse suspicion in the superstitious medieval community. The village healer, Agnes, who was usually consulted for such inexplicable ailments, found herself unable to help a subtle fear creeping into her own demeanor. The Lord's family, desperate for answers, consulted a traveling priest, known for his ability to discern demonic influence. The priest, after examining Thomas and finding no physical cause, began to speak of unnatural causes, of bewitchment, of evil influences. At play, he cited instances of unrequited love leading to dark pacts, of jealous hearts turning to sorcery. The whispers, already circulating, now solidified into a terrifying accusation. Lord Thomas had been cursed, perhaps by someone who wished him ill, or by someone whose love he had unknowingly scorned. The fear in the village intensified, becoming a pervasive paranoia. Priest, eager to prove his worth and cleanse the land of perceived evil, began to question the villagers, looking for anyone who might have held a grievance against Lord Thomas, or anyone whose behavior seemed. Her quiet nature, her solitary existence, and the fact that she was known to occasionally seek remedies from Agnes painted her as a potential suspect in the priest's eyes. He had noticed her lingering glances at Lord Thomas in the past, and her desperate sorrow over his illness, which she had been unable to hide, seemed to him a sign of guilt. He pointed to the unnatural wasting sickness, the strange timing, and the lack of conventional cause as clear evidence of witchcraft. Elara was seized, her protests unheard amidst the rising tide of fear and accusation. She was subjected to a public interrogation, her desperate denials falling on deaf ears. The village, terrified by Lord Thomas's inexplicable illness and egged on by the priest's pronouncements, turned against her. She was brought before the Lord and his family, who in their grief and desperation saw only the possibility of a witch in their midst. The legal proceedings were swift and brutal. Elara was accused of bewitching Lord Thomas, of casting a malefic spell that drained his life force, despite Agnes's efforts to explain the unpredictable nature of love charms, and to defend Elara. The fear of witchcraft was too strong. Elara was found guilty, condemned by the very desperation that had driven her to seek the charm. The consequence for Elara was tragic and irreversible. She was condemned to death by hanging, a common punishment for witchcraft in the medieval period. She was executed publicly, a chilling spectacle meant to purge the village of perceived evil and to serve as a warning to others. Lord Thomas ironically began a slow recovery after Elara's death, the mysterious illness gradually receding. Some said it was the cleansing of evil that healed him. Others wondered if the timing was a cruel coincidence. The love spell, intended to bring her the affection of a nobleman, had instead led to his prolonged illness and her own agonizing death, a grim testament to the unpredictable and often devastating power of desperate magic.